Hey class, I'm recording this on Wednesday, February 8th. Um, there's a series of lectures that you'll hear in this podcast that will make up one podcast. These, I have to admit, these are podcasts that I've done in the last couple of years. I think, except for the first week, the podcasts that I've created for you have been new, and I've recorded them this spring. But this is this most of the podcast you're hearing now, really, except for this one, the little snippets, part of the larger podcast, are podcasts that I've recorded from other classes. But I do think they fit together to make a coherent lecture. Now, there's times when I say stuff like Catton, and that's because I assigned a book by Bruce Catton earlier in earlier semesters. I don't think it worked very well, honestly, which is why I don't assign it anymore. At one point, I say, well, the podcast is over. Well, it's really not over. So just hang in there. You can see how many podcasts there are by the just by looking to the right when you click on the podcast link. So as usual, I'll post a detailed outline of what I'm talking about in this podcast, so you can follow along with it. And that outline is, I think, very useful for you in terms of your note taking, in terms of what you'll be quizzed on and what I'm looking for in the evaluations, the take-home tests, and that kind of a thing. So be aware of those outlines, and I always send the outline when I make the announcement that I posted the podcast. I just think it makes your life a lot easier if you use that. Also, look at maps. For instance, the map I have in front of me right here, it has the different dates of when Southern states left the Union. And as I talked about in class yesterday, just note that the lower tier of Southern states left the Union first. These states actually tend to be the states that had the highest or almost equal proportions of African Americans to whites. For instance, as I said in class yesterday, South Carolina, there were actually more African Americans than whites in 1860. Also along the Mississippi River, in some of the counties in Mississippi and Louisiana, uh, the enslaved outnumbered whites by a factor of 10 to 1. These were very rich cotton growing areas. So the point being that the states that had the largest proportion of African Americans tended to lead first, tended to be most radical when it came to secessions for reasons that we talked about in the Hale document. And we didn't talk too much about the Texas Declaration for the Causes of Secession, but it basically repeats the same old song. And let me repeat those three reasons. Southern white, Southern slaveholders, the Southern slaveholding class left the Union. According to these documents that were used to persuade each other. What you saw with the Hale letter is just one of many documents that were very similar, where whites are talking to each other in the South. But number one, fear of racial equality. Number two, um, um, race war, and number three, intermarriage between African Americans and whites, and also threats, supposedly, of course, this was all hooey, it didn't come to this, but especially threats of sexual violence against white women by African Americans, which didn't happen. But anyway, this is the hysteria of the white South, and it helps explain anyway, or it gives some why, it gives you a sense of why would they do something as crazy as leave the Union. And these were the fears that they had, and I'm not justifying the leaving the Union. As you can hopefully tell, I'm very appalled beyond belief by the slaveholding class, but it's just something you need to know. So, I'm talking about stuff, but just because I talk about it, obviously doesn't mean I approve of it, but I think most of you understand that. I just want you to get into the Southern white mind, but don't stay there long. It's pretty creepy. Um, and then another point I want to make, and I made it briefly yesterday, the idea of the conciliatory war, the war where Lincoln believed, and I talk about this, but I'm a big believer in repetition. In your mind, realize that the period from April 1861 to August 1862, Lincoln doesn't move towards emancipation, at least not publicly. In his mind, he's changing his mind by the summer of 1862. The point being that the Civil War is not an emancipatory conflict for over a year. It doesn't start out as a war against slavery. And that should be very clear after you read Lincoln's first inaugural. So this is what the historian Mark Grimsley calls the conciliatory war period. Then the war takes a harder turn by August of 1862. Lincoln mentions the Emancipation Proclamation. He announces it, and then he signs it in January of 63. So note that in your mind, how dynamic the Civil War is, that it takes on a life of its own, which wars often do. And honestly, we're probably seeing that now in Ukraine, the war between Ukraine and Russia. Although we don't know what the ultimate outcome is, Ukraine certainly, one of the ways the war took on a life of its own. No one expected Ukraine to be able to hold off the Russians the way they've been able to. So this is what happens when you go to war. Southerners may have been confident that they could have defeated the North, but obviously it didn't work out that way. So the conciliatory war, the first 14, 15 months of the war, where slavery is and emancipation is not an issue. So keep that in mind. And this is what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. We're into the conciliatory period. Lincoln he believes that Southern whites can be persuaded to come back into the Union, and he's willing to do that even if they keep their slaves. So this is a period of the Civil War that we're in now. So, like I say, I'll stop here. I have a number of podcasts from, like I said before, different semesters that add up to hopefully a coherent lecture. You will be quizzed on this material next Tuesday.